Okay, everyone, that is time. Okay. Let's all come back to the room. Turn on our cameras. Two, three, four, five, six, 7, 8. Great. And I see that this is a room that is to be streamed. If you have an objection to being streamed, please voice that objection now. Good afternoon. Welcome to round 3 of the Berlin IV. My name is Ohad. I will be your chair for today. No gender preference for this round, excuse me, no gender preference. Let's have our panel introduce themselves as well. Franca.
Hi, my name is Franca. My preferred pronouns are she, they, please.
Great, thank you. And Mashiz, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Hi, I'm Maciej, your day, please.
Great, thank you very much. And speaking order and opening government.
Hi, Kira speaking first. No preference.
Great.
Hamza second, no preference, please.
Okay. Great, opening opposition.
Johannes speaking first.
Amalia speaking first. Shia they.
Amalia
speaking second.
Second, yes. Sorry.
No worries. Closing government.
Vedika speaking first, Chayantan speaking second.
Okay, can you just say your names again?
Yes, Vedika, Chayantan speaking second.
Okay, great. And closing opposition.
Karis speaking first, she, her, please.
Okay, great. And?
Jason speaking second, no preference.
Okay. Awesome. So unless anyone has any questions on the motion or on anything, are we all good? Great. So on the motion that was presented before us, we are happy to call upon the Prime Minister to present the case which stands in their name. Hear, hear.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can. I am reminding everyone that keeping time is your responsibility. There's no other way to do it.
In times of crisis, citizens are rendered defenseless. The usual instruments used to maintain livelihood collapse as economic turmoil takes over. In these instances, the state has a unique capacity and responsibility to provide aid to these citizens, and we're going to prove why UBI is the necessary way. So going to be 2 parts of my speech. First of all, why is universal basic income necessary, both in the sense of why it has to be in the form of cash payments, and secondly, why it has to be universal and why this is the best kind of aid in the situation. And then secondly, looking at why people have that UBI is a fundamental right that people are entitled to in times of crisis, and so principally the state is obligated to provide this money. So starting with why is this necessary? So I think the framing is obviously that there's a massive human cost in any crisis. So economic devastation takes over. People can't earn money because businesses collapse, because people can't go about their day-to-day lives as usual. And this is like one of the biggest byproducts of what happens in a collapse. And note that like economic harms means that people, die of poverty when they're not able to feed their family. So often though it's politicized of like economic harms, these have real impacts on people, which means they're not able to support themselves. So this means they don't earn money to buy necessities like food, medicine. It means they often struggle to access services. So if you can't get like health services in privatized systems, if you don't have the money, then you're locked out of that. Clarification, yes.
Yeah, so like we don't have a pot of infinite money. Presumably this has to come from other services. Can you tell us what trade-offs you're likely going to be engaging in?
I mean, we borrow, like that's what the UK is doing right now when we're giving lots of money. We borrow against our future selves, which is a necessary thing we have to do because people right now are in much more urgent need than the people in the future who are going to get taxed higher to pay this off. I think that's reasonable. Okay, so why does this aid have to take the form of cash payments? A few reasons. First of all, because people make the best choices about what to spend money on. The government has to allow flexibility, given that in times of crisis, people are going to face different challenges. Whether that's being able to heat your house, whether that's being able to pay rent, whether that's being able to buy food and medicine, is incredibly individualized. So any kind of system of giving like coupons or vouchers or giving specific services doesn't tailor to the fact that different the crises affect different people differently based on their geographical situation, their occupational situation, their financial situation. So people get specific agency. I think this is important because of the second reason, which is that psychologically people are able to benefit from having some kind of income and some kind of control over what they do. This is massively important because even the feeling that you have some ability to control what you spend money on makes you feel more secure. In a time of crisis, keeping psychology like calm is massively important, because the more people panic, the more things chaos and spiral out of control, because people don't trust government advice, because people get paranoid, because people feel like it's beyond their control. So giving them a sense of certainty and security that they're going to have that income coming in is incredibly important in terms of making them feel like they control their own life. Thirdly, I think that cash transfer is the most important way, because we need some kind of stimulation to keep the economy going, keep the economy functional. So if when the crisis ends, the damage is limited, because it's significantly easier to like keep a business going than it is to have it collapse and then like rebuild it after the crisis. But also just to mitigate the economic damage which happens during the time of crisis, which means people die from not having enough money. Stimulating the economy through cash payments happens because we're able to increase aggregate demand, or at least stop aggregate demand falling so low that businesses literally collapse, which means it's easier to keep businesses afloat, so people are more likely to have employment after the crisis is over. This is specifically important given during the crisis people are in like dire times, but often we forget about the ramifications that happen afterwards, which go politically unnoticed because everyone's celebrating the end of the crisis without recognizing the damage that it's inflicted during that. So in order to keep up demand and keep the economy going, we need to have some kind of transactions happening, which is why cash payments are effective. Why does this have to be universal? Because this is obviously another distinct feature. A couple of things. First of all, speed is massively important, because in times of a crisis, obviously every step is unprecedented because it's happening so fast. The definition of a crisis means it's not something you can long-term plan for. That means that to be able to give people like means-tested benefits during a times of crisis means fighting through massive bureaucracy. And the time it takes to prove what your income level is or whether you're eligible for this support, people literally die because they can't have the money now. UBI is unique in its ability to quickly get aid to everyone, because everyone deserves it and everyone needs it. That's specifically important. Secondly, even if we don't care about speed, people always fall through the cracks in means-tested systems. In an emergency, that is unacceptable. So, for example, when you, the government, for example, if the government pays people's wages, like they're doing in the UK right now, for a while, it looked like self-employed people were going to fall through the crack because it didn't provide for that. Even if it's not that, people who literally can't physically make it to a government office to be able to show the evidence that they have a low income or that they're eligible for this, or just can't access the eligibility test for whatever reason because they can't get to services because they can't provide that evidence, fall through the cracks and don't get that aid. In a time of crisis, when people are not able to properly plan their lives around this and know what's going to happen in the future, it is unfair that states let anyone fall through the cracks, which is why making it universal safeguards against this. Thirdly, in terms of political capital, making it universal just makes it much more stable because you don't get the same pushback. I think that's important, specifically because like during a crisis, like the rollback effort after the crisis is also as harmful as like providing or not providing it itself. You need to have something which is politically stable that you got a lot of support for, so that the amount of it's continued, so that it doesn't go down over time. When people feel like it's something they're entitled to, as opposed to something we give poor people because they can't provide for themselves and there's lots of stigma against it, that makes it a lot more unstable. So the universal aspect of it is critical. This is particularly important, for keeping up people's livelihoods, but also because having any kind of political voice, having any kind of accountability or mobilization is contingent on you having some level of income so that you can focus on political issues and hold your government to account, rather than focusing on day-to-day survival, which is significantly worse. But let's move on and talk about why the government has people have a fundamental right to be entitled to UBI, and therefore why governments should provide. First of all, I think is the principle of self-defense, because you have to be able to defend yourself against problems which you have no control over, could not have reasonably foreseen, and have literally no mechanism to help yourself get over. That's the definition of state safeguard. What's unique about the time of a crisis is that everyone uniquely faces these problems. But why this principle translates so nicely into UBI is that every citizen has the right to self-defend, but they're all defending against different enemies because they all have different things in their life that get disrupted because of the crisis. So that's why the government self-defense wouldn't be effective if the government gave everyone the same weapon to deal with it through any kind of specific provision, because that wouldn't adapt to individuals' needs that they have to protect themselves against, which is why UBI is important for upholding agency so that everyone can exercise their right to be defended against unforeseen circumstances. And that's why cash is necessary. The second reason that the government have an obligation to do this is because they're the only actor with the reasonable capacity to be able to pull something off of this scale and of this magnitude. And if they're the only one that can protect people, it's necessary that they should, given that otherwise they are literally making the active decision to condemn lots and lots of people to destruction, to having their lives ruined, to poverty during a crisis. That's important. But thirdly, and I think this is massively important, is that crises only happen when government control fails, because crisis management is the literal role of a government. So when the crisis has failed in public health management, when the government has failed in financial deregulation, which made the whole system terrible and meant we had a collapse, they should be the ones which are protecting people, because it is their responsibility a crisis happened, because it was their job to stop it. I'm very proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister very much for the speech and are very happy to call upon the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Thank you very much. I presume everything is working audio-wise. Fantastic. Honourable Speaker, to say that borrowing helps not make trade-offs is nonsense. We can borrow just as much money on both sides of the house, and on our side we can target that borrowed money. Targeting aid is especially important in times of crisis, where we need as great resources as possible, as well targeted as possible, and yes, as quickly as possible. Therefore, we make a counter proposal. We will relax the bureaucracy and the criteria in terms of, accepting applications without going through them in nearly as much scrutiny. Only part of them may be screened, some of them simply may be accepted outright, whatever. We're going to be, doing that in a massively simplified process in the crisis environment. But we're not going to eliminate those criteria completely. They will be checked through afterwards with a reasonable application of those criteria, where people genuinely thought that they were entitled into something and then turns out they technically weren't. Look, we're just only going to punish demonstrable abuse, but we will apply that criteria because we trust people to be generally honest, while also we are capable of preventing the worst abuse quite simply. Where people fall through the cracks for whatever reason, and let them access government-backed loans similar to student loans that can later, if it turns out that the need can be later demonstrated, those can be even further reduced or written off entirely. But this way we can, deal with all these niche cases of, people falling through the cracks, and we can deal with the speed issue simply by being substantially more relaxed in terms of how we apply the criteria for welfare, etc., without diluting all of the money we have by giving it to actors that don't need it. So first, what does this look like? For example, it means that we have more money available to providing, support for those who lose their jobs. Let us take the current crisis, for example. We don't think we want to dilute any of our money. Wait, is that clarification, CO? No. Okay, CG, go ahead.
Your lack of income means that people aren't going to have enough money to buy food. Please tell me, whose jobs are you going to be securing? Everyone's, or only those who survive your crisis?
Look, there's not going to be a lack of money where these applications can be processed within a matter of days. We don't think we're going to have people starving off. And I will talk about, the business aspect of it in just a moment, because we still think maintaining cash flow is important. And we do that best by making sure that those people who do lose their jobs get ample unemployment benefits, get ample welfare benefits, allow them to continue spending. They can even be elevated from what we normally give to unemployed people, because obviously we are not trying to incentivize people to get work in the same way we normally are. We're trying to compensate people for the jobs that they have lost. So we can make further allowances in that respect, right? But so, and we simply believe that the way to, the idea that, by giving these, people who are, work as computer programmers or whatever, who can work from home from their home office, oh, what a terrible sacrifice, right? By giving those people the universal basic income, they think that this extra spending is going to support the business, and that's how they justified it. Look, we would rather support businesses in sectors which are most affected. In other words, the ones where people cannot or will not spend their spare cash in any way due to the crisis. For example, in the status quo, think restaurants. Then give money to people to spend on specifically those businesses that would do fine anyway, like online services of various kinds, right? You can give people as much money as you want through universal basic income, and restaurants aren't going to do any better because they're closed. right? So therefore, we don't think that simply increasing, this sort of aggregate demand in general is going to do very much when the businesses failing are not usually failing just because the economy, generally speaking, is sluggish. They're failing because of specific issues relating to their specific business, not being something that you can do or not being in demand due to the crisis directly. This is where the vast majority of the business negative downsides are in. And by trying the idea that you can support businesses through UBI is just structurally wrong, because people spend money on businesses which are viable at the moment, right? So you're only ever going to be supporting, basically, through UBI, businesses that probably would be doing fine anyway, and that just is completely against any reasonable purpose. Furthermore, we believe that, the idea in terms of any amount of money that you have for UBI, could simply, even if you just gave it to low-income people or or in particular to those who lose their jobs, means that they have a substantially lesser decrease in their disposable income than they would under the UBI system, where, remember, those people who lose their jobs, are unlikely to be providing a UBI that is going to be, anywhere near the median wage. Whereas if you provide a welfare benefit, you're going to get a heck of a lot closer to it than you could ever do with a UBI, because right now, in the worst case scenario, we are going to be looking at unemployment, 20%, 30%. That means that you can, if we just pretend that's the only thing we care about, right? We can give 3 to 5 times more money to those unemployed people than they would be receiving on the government side of the house, where that is diluted across the entire population, right? Because even as much as this is a time of crisis, even as much as it justifies greater borrowing, greater government spending, etc., and there are certainly responsibilities that the government has in general to protect its populace, the way to fulfill those responsibilities is specifically by targeting the aid as much as possible. And let me just reiterate, we can do targeting, even if we're not quite as precise with the targeting, especially initially, as we can be in normal times, because we are going to prioritize speed over accuracy. Even if we're in the worst case scenario, let's say 20% of all the applications that will get in are just completely fraudulent. Well, we're still targeting with 80% efficiency. And I don't think 20% of people are especially likely to be doing something that is clearly a crime that can give jail time after the crisis is over and after the applications are gone through in somewhat more detail. We think this paperwork is worth doing so that our money can be spent in the best way possible, and it can be done quickly through a combination of honesty now and checking later, which also promotes that honesty now. So in other words, we support the idea of cash payments to some extent, but we think businesses should be supported directly because they are impacted through the crisis directly, more so than they are through this sort of, first the economy and then the economy impacting the business kind of mechanism. The direct mechanism is much, much stronger. So therefore, we believe they should be supported directly. And when it comes to people, we should prioritize our support for those that need it. Very proud to oppose.
We thank the Leader of Opposition very much for the speech and are very happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Can you guys hear me? At the top of this speech, I want you to note that 2/3 of UBI opposition bent seems to agree with for some reason. They agree at the top of the speech that income is desirable to services. Good luck closing opposition. They also agree that this should be a basic income, which is necessary to sustain you on some level during a crisis. The only disagreement that they have at the top of the speech is the word universal, which is to say that opposition's entire case hinges on the intuition that targeted income is better and more desirable than non-targeted income. I want you to keep this in mind when judging closing opposition's case and the restrictions that opposition has self-imposed on themselves. The first thing I want to say is to break this deadlock of targeted versus non-targeted. The first thing I say here is they completely ignore our argument about political capital. And it's not just an argument which operates in a vacuum, right? The intuition that you're giving everyone money is easier to digest than the intuition that you're giving some people money. But I want to go further than that and look at that in the political psychology during a crisis. Governments are fragile. Governments are threatened. There is mass panic ripping across your nation. What you want to do in those cases is not make a controversial choice to give 5 times the money, like leader of opposition said, to poor people over richer people. They're threatening the stability of governments in especially unstable times. The second thing I say is, they said we have equal amounts of debt that we can take. Oh, really? Who pays this debt off in 10 years or 20 years? This debt is directly bankrolled by payroll taxes and wealth taxes exclusively paid by the wealthiest people in our society. So what you're basically saying to them is, we'll give poor people 5 times as much income as we give rich people, and then rich people will pay for it 10 years later. I just do not think that's going to fly. We heavily win that political capital clash. Their model is not going to happen and is not happening in literally any country on the planet during the coronavirus crisis. The second thing I say about targeted versus non-targeted is economic transmissions, because they assume that money exists in the ether. So if you have money, then you can do things. That's not how anything works. The economy works in the context of a market of transactions. If there are actors in the market who cannot make transactions, then your money doesn't mean anything. If I'm on an island with $1,000, I can only eat it, not much else. Similarly, within the context of a country which faces a crisis, if businesses go under, then your money loses all value because your money can't be spent on things that you need to spend it on. This is why Kira spent 3 minutes explaining to you the economic transmission cycle. Aggregate demand goes down during crises. There is a recession. The best means to boost aggregate demand is to get money in the hands of as many people as possible, crucially, not just people who need it, but also people who don't necessarily need it. In fact, I would posit that the people who don't need that money are most likely to spend it on industries which leader of opposition said are not necessary. I think that's a good thing. I think we disperse that income as much as possible to different industries within the market and make sure that these businesses stay afloat. But then the second thing I really want to say here is that they forget the macro level economic damage which does happen when things like GDP go down. A study by the National Institute of Health within the United States during the financial crisis showed that for every 1% that GDP goes down, 10,000 people die as a direct implication. There are actual human costs to macroeconomic repercussions of crises. It is essential and crucial that we hold up aggregate demand to keep businesses afloat. These are businesses that cannot be brought back up and resuscitated later on. I will take you later. But then the third thing I want to say, which is really important in targeted versus non-targeted, is the intuition of what their model is. Because their model is basically status quo light. What they're saying is, look, we'll target them, but also not target them so we get the benefit of speed, but also some benefit of accuracy. Like, that's not how anything works. The way that the bureaucracy works is that you have an administrative infrastructure set up, then those people make the claims and then decide. Like, it's not that the number of people that you're deciding over is what decides the amount of time it takes. It's setting up the administrative infrastructure in the first place to make those decision claims. Like, that just completely misses how public policy is made. So I still think on some level, you're delaying the inevitable and targeting more and more poor people. The fourth thing I want to say is that it's very, very unresponsive to our rights-based claim. Because there are 2 points of analysis in our principle that we made, which are distinct from the suffering that poor people face. Point number 1, the government is culpable in creating and exacerbating this crisis. The 2008 financial crisis didn't drop down from heaven. It happened because the bank sector was deregulated. The coronavirus didn't have so many deaths because, oh no, it's God's plague. It happened because we weren't prepared with personal protective medicines, with antigen and antibody medicines, etc., etc. The intuition here is that the government is directly culpable in your suffering, and this applies to everyone symmetrically across the UK or across the US or whichever country you may be in. Hence, there is a reparative argument to be made about giving this money to these individuals so that they can use it as they wish. This is an argument which has nothing to do with the poor and still stands at the end of this top half. The second thing I want to say is about self-defense, because we said that self-defense only works if you have the best possible weapon against the best possible enemy that you're facing. What they're doing is giving everyone a bludgeon, which is, this is the same thing, you can use it however you want. We think it's very, very important for you to use each thing differently depending on what your needs are. I think that's important and wins that principle clash. The last thing I want to talk about is the psychology of ownership, which I think is equally important. And I think that applies to both rich and poor people. So for poor people, just the idea of having income is good. They agree with us for some reason. But I think moreover for rich people, it's equally important insofar as you are now comfortable in bargaining agreements. This is arguably the most important thing I will say in my speech. One, companies target and lay off workers during times of crises. We say on one hand, when you have $1,000 a month to fall back on, you have bargaining power against your company. This is very important to understand. They can't lay you off. They can't halve your wages just because they can, because there's not many jobs left. You have more confidence in your bargaining power. But secondly and equally, the owners of these enterprises are getting the same dividend that you are. So just intuitively, there's a less adverse and psychologically terrible reaction to the demands that you're making. Realistically speaking, we agree. In some world, we should only give money to the poor. The money to the poor only means anything if everyone is getting money, because income is contingent on economic performance. Very, very proud to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister very much for the speech and are happy to call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Okay. I'll just put on my timer quickly. So, okay. We think that in times of crisis in particular, we think that it is like particularly important that governments like not only spend a lot of resources to support the population, but that they spend them in an efficient, appropriate way. So if you think about it, like, I think we think that people like experience different levels of insecurity during crises, and we think that government policies should reflect this by addressing the needs of like groups appropriately. So if you give the same amount of money to, for example, a student who in a times of like some kind of crisis is able to continue their studies and does not like experience a drastic change in their life, and then give the same amount of money to someone who works 2 jobs and has like lost them both because of this crisis, we think that on our side, when the student doesn't get as much money, we can implement something that gives the person who worked 2 jobs something that is almost equal, if not like equal to the amount they were earning before, so they can like feed their family and buy their kids school supplies and this type of stuff. But we think that on their side, if we just give the equal amount, we think that the person whose life didn't change that much probably isn't going to like spend that money immediately, because they don't necessarily need it. It's just something like extra. And we think that then you have this other person who is now receiving less than they were before, and they will suffer drastically because of it. So we don't think that having this universal is actually that appropriate, and we don't think that they are like sort of getting anything in return by giving that to people who aren't suffering as much. So yes, we think that people who are sort of affected by this crisis do deserve this aid, but we don't think that every single person deserves the aid, right? Because not everyone just needs it. Like we think that people who are well off wouldn't even spend more, because like we think that like wealthier people actually spend a smaller percentage of their income because they probably have all their needs covered, and then they can save like the rest of the money. So some people in society have savings that they can use when faced with a crisis. So you are not like getting any bang for your buck when you give them more money. And if you want to increase spending, you give more to people who don't have these savings, and you who actually will like spend this. And the wealthy people, for example, people who like own businesses, will also benefit because people have money to continue using the services instead of having these resources allocated in an ineffective way. So like My partner also tells you that we can reduce bureaucracy to increase the speed of like getting aid to people. So we don't think that's a major benefit that they can claim on their side. Whereas if government actually wants to win this debate, they have to justify essentially wasting some of their resources on people who have existing savings, and as a result, giving less, a little less to people who urgently need aid the most. And we don't think this is something they have done so far in the debate, because we think that they say that like people will be mad because vulnerable people will get more aid. We think that giving more aid to people who, for example, lose their jobs is perfectly intuitive and won't result to any major opposition that they want to talk about. So before I talk about what happens after the crisis, I'll take EOI from OG.
Your entire case is hung on proving that you can get the money speedily to these people. Can you give any mechanisms as to how that is going to be possible?
So, for example, we will increase the staff at who are like processing the applications, and we won't like do as many checks as we would usually do. But you still have to apply for it, and you still have to, for example, say that you have lost your job, and so we get some sort of data about who needs the money the most. We don't think that this is that like complicated. We think that we can have some checks and some targeting, but without but with like reduced bureaucracy. So whatever it is in the status quo at the times of crisis, we will just speed it up through any means that we have to take, but while still having some targeting. So why is that targeting so important? So not only are we using resources efficiently during the crisis, but if you think about what happens after the crisis, we don't think that we don't think opening government, like if you're giving money to everyone, you basically have no incentive to gather sort of up-to-date data about like who is suffering the most. So we think that in a system where you have to somehow give the government your status, for example, if you're a freelancer or if you own a business or something, and you're you are suffering economically because of the crisis, then the government knows that this crisis is hitting you specifically hard, so they can sort of check up on you after the crisis has ended. We don't think in a system where no one has the incentive to provide the government with this information, and this information isn't necessarily something that is readily available to the government, we don't think that doing these sorts of like follow-up checks after the crisis has ended and having this sort of up-to-date data about like who has been suffering the most and what we should proceed after the crisis, we don't think that that kind of data exists in a world where we're just giving money away automatically to everyone, right? And we think that this is very valuable when it comes to crises that can have like long-lasting impact, because this UBI is only valid in this motion during the times of crisis, right? So what happens after if you don't have these charts about like how people are being affected by the crisis, right? So yeah, I'll take CG now.
Considering the fact that you are effectively choosing who gets disposable income and who doesn't, please tell me how you're going to justify allocating resources equally after the crisis is done.
But we're not allocating resources equally ever. We're giving money to the ones who need it, to feed their family. We're not giving money to the people who weren't suffering. What I'm saying here is that people, if you have someone who is suffering a lot from this crisis, and but you also have person A who doesn't suffer from this crisis, but you don't have, as a government, you don't have information about like who is suffering the most, then after the crisis ends, you cannot like use this information to adjust the welfare system accordingly. So in essence, you may have this robust system or this sort of wide universal system during the crisis, but you have less data about who should receive more help after the crisis. So I think I've gone. So this is why you should oppose. Thanks.
Thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition very much for the speech, and I'm happy to open the second half of the debate with the Member of Government. Here.
Hi, before I start, I'm really sorry, but I don't want my speech to be streamed, if that's possible.
Excuse me, could you ask that again?
I don't want my speech to be streamed.
Okay. The person running the stream account, did you hear that?
I don't know.
Is there somebody there? Let's see if we can contact them by the chat.